We might as well start. It's 10 after. I didn't realize, oh, this is being webcast? Yes? Ah, it is being webcast. Somebody asked me, I couldn't see if you were there. I see. Okay, no screen. All right, so I am ready for your questions. I said the basic practical things, which in an email, as well as in the last class, about bring 2 green or blue books with you and don't write in them until you get in the room, and come early and wake up on time. I was thinking of offering a personal wake-up call service if anybody wants it, that you could send me your phone number and I will call you at 7 a.m. to make sure you have gotten out of bed. But if many people took me up on that, it would take me too long to do it. Okay, I will be up very early. Okay, so questions about lectures, readings, about specifics, about generalities. Yes, thanks. Uh-huh.
Was that related to the Marx reading, or could you just kind of go over those 3 important?
Yes, I think it is quite important to have at least some crude idea about feudal society in order to understand Marx's arguments. So this may have come up a little bit in other parts of the course, and again, if we all read the same things, I could say, oh, Lord of the Rings, or Ivanhoe, or something to kind of give you some idea of, at least have an image, and that was why I showed those pictures of knights and so forth. But if you look at it from Marx's point of view, feudal society was a society in which social cooperation was organized by the lord or king's control of land, the obligation of the lord's vassals or knights to provide military service, and the obligation of the people who tilled the soil, the serfs, to work the land. And you can see that that system of social cooperation, which Marx would have called a mode of production, and he would have seen it as formed of the means of production and the social relations of production, right? And that would have included the religious beliefs from the church that would have told knights that their obligation to their lord or to the king was a sacred obligation, would have told the serfs that they have to stay on the land where they were born and keep tilling the field. It would have involved the legal understandings in which all different groups had claims to the property, the land, which is that the serfs were obligated to work it, and they had a right to some of the produce from it, and they were obligated to give some of that produce to their lords and so forth. The lords were obligated to collect enough revenue to be able to arm themselves as knights and fight on behalf of their lord and so forth. And then I made the point that so you didn't read this in Marx, although he does refer to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. But I elaborated on that picture by pointing out that it was the success of feudal society in pacifying the countryside and driving out or protecting people from bandits, from raiders of all sorts who had ravaged the countryside in the earlier feudal period, and the success of that set of military and political arrangements in creating peace and stability allowed an enormous growth in the economy, which began to create a new mode of production within feudalism. And you can see it growing up as towns grow, as little manufacturers grow, meaning not big factories, but people who produce things for more than just their own immediate needs and want to trade them. You start to get more use of money. And then the political and social arrangements of the feudal system come into direct conflict with the emerging power of this capitalist mode of production, but which is impeded or constrained or blocked by the existing feudal social relations of production. And I tried to point out that Marx was really right about that, in the sense that within feudal modes of social organization, you really couldn't have free labor, which you couldn't have a labor market because people were legally obliged to stay on the land. You couldn't have land and other natural resources bought and sold because they didn't belong to anybody who had the right to sell them. People had claims to them. I didn't make this point, but even quite late in British history, one of the huge conflicts was that the Queen, it was Queen Elizabeth, or the Crown in general, owned all the mineral rights under the land. So if you owned a piece of land and it had coal on it, the stuff that was under the land was the sovereign's, not yours. So these were all leftovers from the feudal period. And I pointed out that capital, as something you invest to make money on, to make more profit, simply didn't exist. Wealth existed, but wealth was used to keep your political power going by feeding and entertaining all your followers. So that was, yes. And you could look feudalism up on Wikipedia if you wanted to, or you could look up Mark Bloch's great book called Feudal Society, one of the great books. Okay, yeah, Emily, and then. Uh-huh. Yes, there will be a time allotment for each question, and the short answers you'll have more minutes than whatever you had, but it'll still be I have to figure out the exact logistics of this. You know, it could be seven 7-minute questions adding up to 49, and I'd give you a free minute or something. And yeah, and so the grading will be proportional to the minutes with the following weirdness, that since a 3-hour exam has 180 minutes, if you give half a point for every 2 minutes on a question, so if it's an 8-minute question, you give 4 points, and you give 10 free points as a kind of baseline, then you get 100 points. And so for those of us with relatively limited mental capacity, that's an easier way to do it. Figure out what the exam is worth. So, yeah. Yeah, I think so. If you go through the same 4 points that I tried to do the parallel thing for every theory, right? So what is its basic question? And its basic question is, how much power is there in the system? And what does it look at? What does it look for? It looks for where the institutional capacities of the system are. And so, I mean, there is a problem with the word institution, which is that we never, it's incredibly important in the course, but it doesn't have just a clear, delimited definition. But there you would ask about both what the governance capacities of a political system are, that is literally whether it can rule or not, on the ground or in the middle, and what its political capacities are, meaning how well can it bring interests together to get them to cooperate? How well can it knock heads together? How well can it, you know, and again, you're seeing both the capacities and the incapacities of the American political institutions right now. So if we go over the fiscal cliff, that will be at some level a failure of political institutions, not just bad people, like Barack Obama was stubborn, John Boehner was stubborn. No, it's what political institutions do. They are systems, partly at least, they are systems of rules that both constrain and facilitate action, and they, in essence, force people to behave in certain ways, right? That's at the original definition we talked about. They have sort of sanctions built into them. So you have an institution, and if it never enforced its rules, if we allowed everyone to cheat on exams, then exams wouldn't mean anything, right? And the whole institution, insofar as it depended on evaluation and grading and so forth, wouldn't work. Well, there's a somewhat similar thing about political institutions. Can they facilitate cooperation and get things done by enforcing certain rules? And you want to know that. And then its methods are largely comparative historical, and particularly comparative historical in looking at the way the difference between the inputs to the political system, which are the unequal amounts of power and social organization and so forth that different interests have, and the outcomes, which is what kinds of policies and laws and so forth get produced by the political, policies, not just laws and rules, but actual, you pay some people, you take money away from other people, that kind of thing. Benefits, I should use a more direct term, and costs get allocated. And how does the shape or the way that political institutions work affect the relationship between those inputs to the system and the outputs? And I didn't get to the critique. It's on the slide, and you won't be responsible for it, but I'll just indulge myself with 1 minute, literally, that the problem for right now for institutional theory is that the intuition is that stronger, more robust political institutions in general moderate that relationship between inputs and outputs in the direction of more equal, more just systems. But in theory, we don't have any way to differentiate hugely powerful political systems that are evil from hugely powerful, effective political systems that are good. And so the kind of capacities that one of my friends who studies Africa pointed out that Rwanda is one of the best governed societies in Africa, one of the best governed countries, and has been for a very long time. It's got it's very small and densely populated, and that helps, and a bunch of other things help. And that's why the genocide in Rwanda was so effective, because the political leadership could actually call for people to kill their neighbors, and they would do it. So that's the huge critique of institutional theory, that we understand that more powerful political systems overall tend to be better, but we don't really have a way of thinking about how sometimes more power. I'd still rather live in Rwanda than Congo. But it's, so, I don't know if that. Yes, okay, I will. Sorry, yeah, good idea. Let's see, yes. Could I go over the difference between class dialectical and institutional theories of power? Class dialectical theories, the similarity is that both of them focus on outcomes. The difference is that, first of all, class dialectical theories are pretty committed to one answer to that question, which is that the capitalist class or capitalism as a system wins, whereas institutional theories are uncommitted about which group wins. But also, class dialectical theories are still interested in, again, I put up that circle diagram on the board, which I could do again, but that you think of it as a pie, and they want to know how much of the benefits that flow from the political system go to the capitalists or the capitalist system. And they don't ask the question, what leads the system to have more capacity to produce outcomes in the first place? And they almost never ask. In fact, they are, in a very sophisticated way, largely uninterested in the mechanisms, or at least what kinds of institutions capitalists would need to get the outcomes that benefit them. They don't even ask that question. So the real difference is that institutional theory says, granted that the inputs to the, well, I should do it with this hand, granted that the inputs to the political system are unequal. So the people who own the industries have a lot more power per person than the people who work for the industries, the people who are born to elite positions. And we can see it now in the US, big time, big time. People with huge fortunes they either made or inherited can have much more. So Sheldon Adelson, even though he lost most of the things he wanted, could have a huge influence on the political system because he could lay down $10 million on his candidate. So given that things are unequal on the input side, how do the political institutions make a difference in the outcomes? Whereas in a sense, the Marxist class theory say, we don't care about the institutions. We don't care about how it gets done. We just notice that in the end, you can bet your bottom dollar the capitalist class or capital's interests will always be served. And Fred Bloch, I think, he's a sort of somewhere between he's a Marxist institutionalist, I would say. And that's why I love that article. But he really, by looking at business confidence, he says, capitalists don't have to be smart. They don't have to conspire behind the scenes. They don't have to directly control all the levers of power. All they have to do is that if politicians, in their own interest, not trying to serve the capitalist class, just trying to get themselves elected, know that if the economy tanks, they are toast. And if they know that, then they will do things that save capitalism from itself. And that's what you might argue happened in the beginning of 2009 after Obama was elected. He got together with a bunch of people and he did things that many on the left don't like, that made the banks whole and let them get away with murder, because his number one goal was to stabilize the financial system so that American capitalism could continue producing the goodies. Because he knew that if the and maybe he got bad advice and they could have saved the financial system in a way that was more beneficial to the public. I don't know about Geithner's interest, and maybe you need some power elite theory in there to really understand what happened. But the basic idea is that the Marxists say, look, all you have to do is look at the outcomes and know that the capitalist class always wins, or it almost always wins, or it wins almost everything. I guess that would be the way to put it. And the institutional theorists say, no, it really makes a difference what kind of political institutions you have. Is that? And then there was a hand up over there. Yes. Yeah. Okay, in the lecture on Marx, I had a point on the PowerPoint saying classes are total. And what did I mean by that? And this really is a good way to think about the difference between Marx and Weber. That, again, Weber has all these different kinds of interests, class interests, status interests, party interests. Groups can form on any of those bases. And each of those is very complex, right? So you don't just have one class interest. You yourself might have multiple class interests, or there are like interests as a consumer, interests as a producer, interests as an employer. You could have all those at once. So many different. You could be an employee and an employer. Right? You could want to be paid more by your boss, but to pay your own house cleaner less, for example, or something. So for Weber, the issue is very complex. For Marx, especially over the historical long run, but I would say even in the short term, your class interest basically shapes everything else. So it shapes your interest in religion and law and government, because the mode of production and the sort of forces of production and the social relations of production are connected. And so if you are a capitalist, it makes sense to you to really value private property. Those aren't separate feelings. Those are the same feeling. Or if you are in a very privileged situation, it makes sense to you to see the world that the most important thing is that the law has to keep poor people from taking anything away from rich people or whatever. So for Marx, classes are total in the sense that they encompass all aspects of culture and law and religion and other forms of, and again, I don't know if I ever quite drew it on the board, but I had many times drawn that circle that showed all the different directions of cleavages and alliances that could emerge within Weber's understanding of class. And my image of Marx was that at least he's sort of thinking of history as something like the agitator in a washing machine that over time shakes down those things that look like multiple divisions going in different directions. And you see that the underlying division is really between those who own the means of production and those who are enslaved by them, if you want. And again, we might argue that that's happening a little bit more in our own historical era when professions like the legal profession, the professor profession, the medical profession are increasingly getting proletarianized. And those professionals are in fact becoming workers whose skills can be increasingly done by machines, including having their lectures webcast, and then maybe somebody else somewhere could use them and fire the person who would be giving the lectures at that college, or vice versa. So, did I answer your question? Yeah, okay, yes. You had your hand up? No, you were just stretching. Okay. Yeah, Gabby. Yeah, can I explain about the zero-sum approach to power? I think this is, again, quite important. One of the big differences between all of the first three models of power, the pluralist, power elite, and class models, and institutional theory, is that the first three models all look at how much power one group or individual has versus others. So if one person's power grows, because power is basically defined as the ability to get other people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise. If one person's power grows, somebody else's power has necessarily decreased. And that is what you mean by a zero-sum system, that all the changes in the system have to add up to zero. So if A gains, B loses. It's, if you've got $10 to spend on lunch and you go out with a friend together, if you spend $6, she can spend only $4, right? That's all there is. And we might measure the power in your relationship. We might do an experiment by giving you $10 and telling you to go out to lunch together. And when you come back, figuring out what you actually spent. And if you spent $7.50 and your friend spent $2.50, we would conclude that you had more power, especially if it happened every time, than your friend. And institutional theory really looks at something like whether you and your friend can figure out a way to turn your $10 into $12. That's to make this situation not zero-sum. That's, yes?
Hi, may you please explain why the Protestant ethic lasted longer than Reformation?
Yeah. Why did the Protestant ethic outlast Protestantism or outlast Calvinist-type Protestantism? And I had raised that question at the end of my lecture on the Protestant ethic, and it's a really important question. And one answer has to do with theories of culture, which is if culture is carried mainly by the ethos, the mood, the emotional tone, then ideas like the specific doctrines of Calvinism about predestination and proof can generate a new set of emotions, a very high level of anxiety, a very high level of spiritual loneliness, a very high level of sort of anxious self-scrutiny. But once you've got those things in place, the whole society, the whole culture, maybe the way parents rear their children, maybe the way people interpret things in daily life, can sustain that ethos, that emotional tone, even when the ideas die out. So that's one possible argument. I think a second very powerful argument that I didn't articulate very clearly in class, but I actually believe it, so I'll. One of the other things that I did talk about briefly is that Protestantism really, Calvinist Protestantism, the radical form of Protestantism, really cut off most sources of spiritual comfort and release. So you couldn't go to your priest and get, say, confession and feel that you were squared away, that everything was fine. All your mistakes, all your sins, all your failings stayed with you, and there were no, and really Calvinist Protestantism literally went around and smashed most of the sculpture and destroyed most of the art in many European churches. This is where the word iconoclasm comes from. The iconoclasts literally destroyed a great deal of the religious art in Europe because they didn't want anything that mediated between the believer and God. They didn't, no priest, no sacraments, nothing that could make you feel better. And this, the broad term for this is demystification of the world. So instead of believing that there's a saint on your saint's day, one of the major kings of France, I think it was Louis XI, one of the feudal kings, wore a little gold crown that had a whole bunch of saints' images in the gold, I mean, carved in the, molded, however you make that. And he could take it off and pray to the saint of the moment. So if he needed to pray to Saint, George or something to win a battle, he had St. George right there on his crown, and he could pray to him right then and there. And that Protestantism just completely eradicated that, and you'll still see that a really, upscale Protestant church will have an extremely simple cross and not even the body of Jesus hanging there. There's nothing. There's no visual thing to hang on to. And so another argument about what sustained the ethic of the Protestant ethic is that many of the ways that people comforted themselves and reduced anxiety about how they should feel, many of the small spiritual comforts people had available were removed. And without those, you are left with a much heavier burden of organizing your own spiritual state. And that may produce this level of sort of rationalized self-scrutiny and spiritual anxiety sort of turned into a constructive form. I think you could even push it a little bit further and say that if you throw out most of the explanations for why life works out or not, that the deep believer in an active God has. That is, if something terrible happens and you believe that if you right then and there get down on your knees and really pray to God or pray to Jesus, you will be helped. And that if something terrible happens, it really was because it was meant to happen. And if you just open yourself to that truth, you can feel comforted because you know it, however sad it was, it's part of God's plan. And if you believe that, that is very comforting. If you don't believe it, and the Puritans, the Calvinists did not believe it. They did not believe it. And once you take that away, I think the problem of how to live becomes a much more self-conscious, much more anxious thing, because you're kind of alone. That would be my explanation. Yes?
Bouncing off that one, how did work get tied into predestination? I understand
Yeah.
what your actions reflect whether or not you're saved.
Right.
But why does it work?
Yes. Right. How did work in particular get tied into predestination? That is, if the implication of the Calvinist doctrine of proof was that you couldn't know for sure whether you were saved or damned, but that was true about you. You were either saved or damned and you couldn't know. And the doctrine of proof said you would see it through the rationalization of your own conduct in work. And she's asking, why did they focus on work rather than on service or something like that? And so one answer is actually that I think in true Calvinism, it doesn't have to be economically productive work, that essentially if you wanted to discipline your life, something that keeps you busy all the time, in other words, that really rational, but it couldn't be, so it wouldn't have to be work like economically paid work that makes you rich. It could just be disciplined labor. And in fact, Weber, in the actual book, The Protestant Ethic, he talks about the paradox that some groups of very religious people got rich in spite of themselves. They weren't trying to get rich. They were just trying to live totally disciplined lives of the kind God would have wanted. So they would go and they would, you know, pick the fruit from their tree, and then as soon as they picked it, they would start turning it into canned goods or jam or something, and then pretty soon they would be selling the jam, and this religious community would get rich in spite of itself because they were so disciplined, because they worked so hard without spending. So I think that many, many kinds of earthly effort are relevant, but it's true that Calvinism did emphasize active work in the world, not spiritual withdrawal, meditation. So you could imagine a different kind of ethic, the kind that Luther grew up with, where if you want to be really pure and really good, you lock yourself away from the world, you starve yourself, you pray day and night, you wear a hair shirt, you lie on a bed of nails, and so forth. And Calvinism condemned that. And I think the answer is that it saw human beings living in disciplined communities as the only way to glorify God on earth, and work of some sort was, so I don't know if you know, there's an old phrase, idle hands make or the devil's work or something like that. So little girls were trained to become, you were always supposed to have something in your hand. And the idea of selling it wasn't important. You were practicing your needlepoint or your embroidery, or you were, you know, making a sampler. So if you ever go to the De Young, I don't know if they still have it, but in their kind of history section, there's a 17th century sampler on the wall made by a little girl, and it literally is one of these things that says, you know, now I lay me down to sleep. It's not this exact one, but I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. You know, little children were thinking about their death and whether they were saved or damned all the time. And they were supposed to be kept busy. Everyone was supposed to be kept busy. So that's not a perfect, so the answer is it's not a theological link that says you have to work in the world and make a lot of money to show you're saved. That actually was kind of a late interpretation in which getting rich showed you were somehow superior. And that did happen in the sectarian groups that formed. But I think the original form was you have to be kept busy. I'm going to go, yes.
So just kind of understand that more. So I know like the Bible talks about how if you like love others or like have people know you're Christian, so under that type of Calvinism, that would exclude that from the fruits of salvation.
So the question is, given that the Bible, and particularly the New Testament, places a lot of emphasis on loving one another, and what Weber actually calls brotherly love, but the sort of primitive Christian community was very, very devoted to the notion that God is love, and that was very central. What happens to that? And the answer is that Calvinist Protestantism, not all Protestantism, but Calvinist Protestantism is very Old Testament centric. And actually they completely suppressed the cult of Mary, so no Mary at all. And they very, very considerably suppressed Jesus. So they remained Christians, and they may have kept the name of Jesus in their prayers, but their real, think about it, if you have this all-powerful deity that if God created the world and set it in its course and foreordained from the beginning of time the fate of every soul, Jesus is coming to offer salvation. Not very relevant to the story. And actually some of this breaking of all the statues and everything, what do you think those statues were of? Jesus and Mary and saints. And, I mean, so the answer is that they did not emphasize God as love. They emphasized God as a sort of very frightening divine judge. Yes? Could I give an overview of Davison Moore's theory of stratification? Again, there you'll get it. You should just read it. If you read it once, you should really understand it. So it's so clear. But anyway, they try to look at why different positions are differently rewarded. So, I mean, one interesting thing about them is that instead of asking why some people have more privileges or more benefits in society than others do, they ask why some positions carry greater social rewards than others. What we would call some jobs. Why are some jobs more rewarded than others? So they try to explain why there is social inequality in society at all, and particularly why there is inequality, again, not between one person and another, but between the rewards that go to one position versus another. But they mean their theory to apply to societies that have kings and no jobs in our formal sense. So the feudal system, for example. Why would societies be set up so the king gets jewels and courtiers and dancing girls and musicians and so forth, and the serf gets almost nothing? And they make this functionalist argument that positions are rewarded more when the contributions they make to the society's well-being are more important, and the skills required to do that job are scarce. So it's a combination of, you might say, supply and demand or something like that. How important is the task and how rare are the skills? And so they can explain even things like a hereditary king for which there's no competition of skills getting rewarded, because the argument is that if you're the emperor of China or you're the king of a country, you have to sort of be encouraged over your whole life to regard this as a sacred calling, because if you collapsed and quit or something, the whole society would be so demoralized. You're this central symbolic figure. It's like if somebody became pope and then said the next day, you know, I just have decided I'm not interested. I'm going to convert to Islam, or I've decided I don't believe in God. I think I'll give up. And so like that. So that's the argument they make. There was right here. Yes. Were you next? I mean, you had your hand up, right, already? Yeah. Okay. So the question is about American individualism and voluntarism. And I think the way to understand this is to say that America was, at its founding and for much of its history, a predominantly Protestant country. So even though there is no state religion, it's not built into the Constitution anywhere, it was founded by and it developed out of Protestant cultural presuppositions. And you can see that both the early Dutch settlers and the early Puritan settlers and the early, basically all the early settlers were different varieties of Protestant. And so although there's been much immigration and huge influence of Catholicism and of other religions more recently, America really is a Protestant country at base. And the aspects of Protestantism that became incredibly central in American society were not only beliefs in the individual's choice determining fundamental things about religion. And remember, all the way back to Durkheim's Suicide, where Durkheim says, look, and he's talking about France, and he says, Protestants are left more to make decisions about their faith than Catholics are. Remember, this goes all the way back. So when you read Suicide, there's a connection. Durkheim says Protestants have to decide, they have to read the Bible for themselves. and this was true even for the Calvinists, everyone had to read the Bible for themselves, and that meant that at some level the individual's own religious commitment mattered. This became even more true in the sects, the Protestant groups that really became influential in American society, the Baptists, the Methodists, one after another, the evangelicals in our own period. So there's both the sort of idea that religious choice is fundamental to forming the religious community, and then the specific form of that is the idea that all communities are, this was an idea that really, I would say, didn't exist hardly anywhere on the planet until Protestantism. I mean, you can see elements of it maybe in the early primitive church, you can see elements of it in human communities all over the world, but the idea that human beings become a community by choosing to join together. They're not born into it, they're not required by the divinity to be a part of it. It's not necessary to the harmony of the universe. They choose it. That was fundamental to the way Protestants organized themselves socially. They organized in this congregational form. And they may have done it because they couldn't get to be state churches in most of the places they were, right? But it's very basic also to the way to their actual theological understanding that if you don't yourself choose to be saved, if you yourself don't make yourself, you've got to decide. You've got to decide that you believe. You've got to decide that you're going to give your life to Christ. It's not a hereditary obligation. It's up to you. And that understanding of how groups form became very fundamental to American life. And I pointed out that it's there even when it's clearly metaphorical. That is, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, which are the opening sentences of the Declaration of Independence, it is not true that we chose, those of us who are Americans, we did not choose to be here. Almost all of us, the immigrants maybe chose, but not, they didn't choose to form it. They didn't get a choice about it. They came to it and it was already that way. And most citizens of it didn't choose it. But we believe that the only kinds of valid social organizations are the ones that people choose. And therefore, we have a twist on Protestant individualism that emphasizes the features of a person and of social relationships that people would need in order to be good choosers, right? Then if choosing is what makes social groups cohere, then people have to be honest in telling other people what they want. And you can see that in everything from a love relationship where people will say, and I hope no one's saying this to you, but we should have an arrangement in which we can date other people so that we're clear about what we want, and that's fine. And you can't make some argument like, wait a minute, it's not human nature. It's human nature to be jealous. It's human nature to want one person. It's human nature to want the person who loves you to love only you. That goes back to our primitive bond with our mothers or whatever. I mean, you could make an argument, but not in American culture you can't. You can make the argument that you have to agree, and as long as the terms are clear and you've been honest, you can see I don't subscribe to this, but then any arrangement is fine. And no arrangement is fine if you didn't choose it. So I made the point that Americans will talk as if, as adults, they chose to love their parents. And I just submit that no Asian would ever think that way. It's not about choosing, right? And there's another, I'll just, slight detour here, but I have watched a fair number of Japanese films without being, just TV, like crappy films. And so I was watching this one, and a boy was behaving rebelliously, and then his grandmother came to him in a dream, and she told him the agonies his mother had suffered in childbirth. And then he realized everything was wrong, that he was doing was wrong, and he became a good boy again. And I thought, no American mother would ever tell her kid, I mean, unless very neurotic parent, yes, but your basic deal is it is not part, I'll put it this way, it is not part of the standard cultural repertoire in America to basically say, the agony of bringing you into the world, I labored for days, or, it almost killed me or whatever. And I think the idea of how much your family sacrificed is a huge part of the narrative in many other cultures, not just childbirth suffering, but all sorts of agony. So, I just think that's part of American culture is you do things because you choose them. And choosing is really important, and that, of course, ties into, as I kept flogging this point, preschool in three cultures, which emphasizes, the American preschool emphasizes creating these little tiny creatures that can already choose. Okay, and I think there was a hand here.
Could you explain
Dominic.
why pluralism is the theory of power?
Yeah, why is pluralism the prevailing theory of power in political science and sociology? I mean, prevailing is a funny word because I think to the degree that sociologists think about that, they've started saying, I don't want to think, if it has to be pluralism, I don't want to think about it at all. But one reason is that sociology is very interested in social movements, and actually in some ways more interested in social movements than in the governments social movements seek to change. But because of that, they're very interested in how groups get a little chunk of power and manage to change things. So the civil rights movement is a never-ending source of fascination. There are book after book after book after book after book. And it's a fascinating movement to study, and actually some of the best work on social movements has been done about the civil rights movement. But if that's kind of your paradigm, where a group that's excluded from power, that basically lacks the vote, that's on the margins of the political system, in many ways on the margins of the society, can, if they're committed enough and they organize and they fight and they use moral rhetoric, can demand a little corner of power and can influence things, that, that's, so I maybe put it too strongly. I don't know if it's the reigning model. And again, I think if you read, well, one of the interesting questions is what model of power or a political system are Hacker and Pearson in winner-take-all politics? What model are they really using? And I think they actually provide evidence that would support several different models, not just one. But you can see that the picture in which many different interest groups are active fits a very American understanding of the world, right? It's a little bit like whoever chooses to get involved can make a difference. What if your politicians told you, you can't make a difference? The powerful hold all the levers. You can't make a difference. That's the most un-American thing I've ever heard. So that's one answer. Are there hands over here that I've missed? Yes, sorry.
Last time you mentioned the idea of the nation state giving us
Yeah. Say a little more about that. So last time I mentioned the idea of the nation state being archaic. And sometimes people use the following slogan. It's too small for the big problems and too big for the small problems. And so this is people who believe that you could have something like decentralization or devolution of power. So local areas could become more powerful, and you could have kind of global governance in big transnational things for things like the ecological problem, and to run world migration, and maybe to run world capitalism and keep the international monetary system stable and so forth. And then you could have more localized governance, and you'd get rid of this sort of middle layer. Of course, get rid of is too strong. So I guess I don't mean that it's archaic. I tried to make the point that it is both being weakened by many different kinds of forces, and it's the only thing that provides forms of democratic access and places where your rights are guaranteed. So there is now an international criminal court. And it is imaginable, actually, that you could conceive of yourself as having human rights that are guaranteed in some very distant sense by the UN. But in fact, what the UN tries to do is get your own government to actually guarantee you rights, not kill you, not torture you, not, deny you health care, whatever it is. So even the things that are globally increasingly sanctioned depend on the nation state. So I would argue that it's both inadequate to and not fully in control of many of the things that it, at least during the long 20th century, maybe the 19th and 20th was sort of the era of the nation state, and that it's still the only game in town for many, many purposes. So you can't live with it and you can't live without it. All right, I will see you at the exam, and I hope you have fun writing your papers. And again, don't forget on the papers, really pay attention to how to interpret the class of the people you interviewed in terms of Marx's and Weber's theory. And you can do that in a complex way, even if neither theory really works. Okay?